Hi, everyone. Thank you for having me. I'm Ryan Sentner from Geography at the London School of Economics. What I'm going to be talking about today is quite different from what Andrew was just giving us with this very rich, historically detailed, textured understanding of gentrification. I'm going to be taking a step away from that kind of historical detail and indeed a step away from what many might term gentrification in a narrower sense, but trying to look at this a bit more broadly about control over space and squabbles, or something perhaps much more significant than just squabbles over space, and often in terms of use rather than specifically or only residence. And I start off with this image of Rio de Janeiro in Brazil, looking from the favela, this, we could call it an informal settlement, but it's quite rooted there, but from the favela down towards a much more formalized apartment community on the Atlantic there. And I do this to illustrate some sense of city fracture, as I have here, but also to lay the ground for talking about spatial capital, how space itself can be a resource in different places and exchanged among other forms of capital. So I want to just give a brief background and lead into a first case as I talk very quickly through these cases about where I got the idea of spatial capital from. Not just thinking about space as a resource, which is, of course, nothing new on many fronts, but actually coming from the specific context of where I was as a graduate student at University of California, Berkeley, across the bay from San Francisco here, during the first internet boom of around 2000. So at this time, the city was flooded with newcomers working for internet startups, often flush with cash from venture capitalists. And although I was the same age at the time as many of the youngest startup entrepreneurs, I was living in a very different reality as a master's and PhD student. So I might socialize on occasion with some of these peers, but I could see that they were living in a very different kind of situation, not only as newcomers to the city, but as new city users using the city very differently from other people around them. So some of the things I noted on the street where I lived in the Mission District, Valencia Street. You can't quite see it here, but there's a median going through here, the same level as the rest of the street. I noticed people coming to this area which has very little parking, and leaving their cars simply in the middle of the street, not just in this block, but in many others. This was a practice that was costly if you got ticketed, which you almost always would, as it was often done immediately in front of a police station, but also even more annoying if your car happened to get towed away. But the bars and restaurants on this street and others around it were chock full of these dot-commers at the time, for whom this seemed as just perhaps a slightly more expensive kind of valet. So I started to study this in terms of I knew who these people were, but I wanted to know more about how they were thinking about the city, how they were using it in particular ways. And so I set out to do a project when I was at the master's stage about how people were thinking about and using space in the city in connection to other forms of capital that they might have. But I set out first to actually ask them to map the city, not expecting them to have any cartographic expertise and assuring them of this, that they were not going to be judged about it in the interview, but then to come up with their own sort of mapping of what do they think the city looks like, what places stand out to them, where do they tend to go. So asking them to do this kind of mental mapping here. From the image of the city with neighborhoods specified above, I wouldn't show them that, but you can contrast that to one of the more representative examples here of sort of nature here in Golden Gate Park with a smiling face. Rich people live here in the sort of upper left-hand corner there. And this drawn by a dot-commer herself. So the reason that I was asking them to do this was to get them to say what places they used and in what ways, and how they thought of other places in the city relationally, how they related to them in their daily routines. This led me to eventually come up with this, to further conceptualize this idea of spatial capital as the power to take place. Not that these people at the dot-com moment in the early 2000s were invincible and ultimately powerful, but that they were wielding a kind of power that could have been wielded by other groups at some point, at some particular historical juncture, but this seemed to be something new. So I started to theorize this as spatial capital, specifically as a resource in a field where space is at stake. That this was the ability to make beneficial use of space. It didn't matter if it was public or private, and I wasn't particularly concerned with whether they actually owned the space, but how they used it. This is getting more into Bourdieu's language here, as I'll talk more about Bourdieu in a second. It entails the misrecognition of privileged access to and control over space. Misrecognition being Bourdieu's idea that there is no particular legitimacy to this, but that this is recognized broadly, socially, as somehow legitimate or misrecognized. So this results in potentially the changing character of a place. And as I was finding in that San Francisco research, that it can be quite visible in contexts where we have new city users or new groups emerging of whatever kind. So people coming into a field of space and using it differently with different kinds of resources. So in San Francisco, I could watch this happening, not just in terms of where people were parking on the street, but how they would use public space of all kinds, how they would mark off territory. I won't get into a full example here, but this is, well, aside from being one of my favorite places in the world, Dolores Park in the Mission District of San Francisco, this park of two blocks by 2 blocks fills up on the weekends especially, and we could watch during this early spatial capital research how people were using this space. For example, all of these 25 to 30-year-olds having a wine club party on the weekend right in the middle of the playground in the center. Blatantly illegal, as it is in almost every US city, to drink alcohol in public. But these people were able to turn away the police in their various loops through the park to say, okay, what's happening here with these 40 bottles of wine out on the picnic tables? Oh, nothing to worry about, sir, it's all fine. There were ways that these dot-commers, in their well-educated and high-standing backgrounds, so coming from both money, many of them, but also from very elite educations at Ivy League schools, et cetera, were able to have a sort of easygoing, diplomatic repartee with the police and encourage them to just let them continue on partying, monopolizing this space in very illegal ways, and also taking over the neighborhood children's playground. So this could happen in a number of different situations. Now, just to return to Bourdieu for a second, it's important to remember 3 key aspects of Bourdieu's ideas. He talks about multiple forms of capital and the convertibility among those different forms. He specifically focuses on economic, cultural, and social capital, as well as symbolic capital. Symbolic capital being any misrecognized form of these previous 3 that is transferred among them. In a nutshell. I could go on much further, so I'm happy to take questions about this. Habitus, then, a second part of his framework, is about the accumulated dispositions that enable judgments by a group, by individuals or by a group, to use particular forms of capital to some effective end within a field. And he thinks about fields as fields of relations, of positions, and action. He often thinks about rather abstract fields, the field of economists, the field of impressionist painters. My argument here with spatial capital is that it's not only possible, but it's important in some contexts to think about a field of material or physical space. Bourdieu has some writings about his ideas on this, but they're rather brief and appear near the end of his life, but I'm happy to talk about those if people have questions. So in recasting this idea of field as being about space, we can think about spatial capital as a form of symbolic capital in a field where physical space is at stake. Now, I won't go into many details here about urban space as a field, but we can think about urban space as a site where there are struggles over definition, over who's central to this space, who is important, in control in some way. How are the edges or divides marked off as to what is included in a certain field of urban space? What counts as part of a neighborhood? What counts as part of a central district? What counts as an historic preservation zone, et cetera? This can delimit value. It can also serve to include and exclude, leading us to recognize valued and valid features of various participants. There can be multiple practices to this. I'll give some quick examples in the cases as I go through them now. In San Francisco today, it's a very different context, but in many ways we see a much more amplified situation of this wielding of spatial capital by privileged groups, even more so by those involved in the internet economy, which has, as you must know, expanded dramatically and has certainly been well cited in San Francisco. Google, Facebook, Dropbox, all of these very familiar companies to people around the world are either based in San Francisco or have very sizable operations there. So much so that the Google buses, which this is a rather grainy photo, sorry for that. The Google buses, which take employees from different neighborhoods in the city in private buses to Google headquarters, have become a form of mass transportation in their own right, although it's not serving the masses publicly, but serving the masses of Google employees in a restricted way in the city, mirroring, but in many ways outdoing, the actual system of public transport in the city, which you can see here. This has led to quite a lot of protest against the Google buses, one of which you can see here blocked by protesters. Protests over the way that they use public infrastructure for free, protests over the way they block traffic, indeed in some cases park in the middle of the street, the way that they take up parking places in the rest of the city. So this has taken on some rather colorful forms of protest. Here you can see them blocking, parking in the middle of the street. Now, to turn to the question of righteousness. The subtitle for my talk was Urban Currencies of Righteousness. And to return to Dolores Park, or a playground adjacent to it, I want to show you very quickly some parts of a clip from a conflict that happened in October of last year between longtime residents of the park in the middle and on the left, longtime residents of the neighborhood, lifetime residents, and newcomers who worked for Dropbox. These young men, the one holding up the piece of paper, he or some of his colleagues were wearing their Dropbox t-shirts as they went to go play soccer after work. They had reserved, the one holding the paper, he and his coworkers had reserved the space to start playing at 7 p.m. for an hour for $27 US. The tradition in the park had always been, however, to have a kind of alternating free, no reservation system where winners would play a new team and the losers would have to leave, etc. So they challenged the situation was challenged here. So I'll just show you a few very brief parts of this that I think are key. And sorry,
for the field, you don't get to book for an hour to take over these kids' fucking like. There is no 7 to 8 anything. If you want to play pickup, you play pickup like the rest of us. It's not pickup. You can book the field. You can book the field. Just because you got money and you can pay for the field, you don't get to book it for an hour to take over these kids' fucking like.
Is Connor here?
Bullshit. No, it's bullshit.
Okay, so he's saying just because you have money doesn't mean you can kick these kids off the field when there hasn't been this system of reserving in the past. This confrontation goes on for some time.
This field has never been booked. Okay. You don't understand.
So
this field has never been booked. The last 3 years. How long have you been in the neighborhood, bro? How long have you been in the neighborhood?
Who gives a shit who?
Over a year.
Who cares about the neighborhood?
Oh my God. How long have you been playing here for? Because my whole life, I've been born and raised here for 20 years, and my whole life we've been playing.
You can share. One time, you let other people play.
We will share with you. Why don't you get a team and we play pickup 7v7 like it always is?
All that we understand.
There is no permit. It does not matter if there's a piece of paper.
Why don't we all just play? I would love to play you guys.
Let's do that.
Then let's play. Then let's play. You got a team. We got a team. Let's play.
Okay, so you probably heard there's like, how long have you been in the neighborhood, bro? So been there for over a year. Oh, over a year. And then someone else jumps in from the Dropbox team and says, who cares about the neighborhood? So this is obviously a clashing sense of sort of righteous belonging in this space and use of this particular place. Now, just give last bit here, and I'll move on. So this man in the cap has just shown up with the permit that they've been insisting that they have.
You guys understand this? Like, it's pretty simple, man. Like, this is what we paid $27 to reserve the field for now.
You paid $27 to
Read
reserve
it.
the
Read
field.
it, man.
I know how to read.
Okay.
I'm an educated person.
I'm
I'm also know that this field has always been a pickup field where you play 7v7 and wait your turn. And you guys think that just because you have money, you can buy the field and play and take over the field and go to 7v7.
For people
I
to
don't
okay.
care about this. What you do?
I don't mean
It's really awkward and weird.
That's
Like we're part of the community and we're trying to play.
I want
But
this.
you're
I want
being
this
really
film.
weird, man.
How am I being weird?
Awkward and disastrously weird.
What are you talking about, dude?
All right, so the guy filming it is being awkward and disastrously weird, according to him. As he's asking, not just asking, he's insisting that people read this piece of paper which shows his right to be there. All right. Nope. Okay. Okay, sorry. Okay, so moving on from the context of San Francisco, which I think you can see is only more ramped up in how these kinds of conflicts are playing out. I want to quickly move on to 3 other places where I've done research since this time in San Francisco. I'll have to move very, very quickly at this point. So moving on to Buenos Aires, Argentina. What you see here in this neighborhood is one of over 30 different complexes like this, all strung together, that were initially meant to be state housing for teachers, but were quickly sold off and eventually deteriorated quite significantly as they became available to other users, especially poorer users, but not the poorest of the poor in the city of Buenos Aires. Across the street from this and under an elevated motorway, we have the even poorer, some of the poorest in the city living here. This, in this shantytown, or Vicha, as it's locally called, this Vicha burnt to the ground just months after I took this first photo as I was doing fieldwork in the towers across the way. It burnt to the ground in arson. It was not an accident. People were immediately rehoused in emergency tents here, next to the towers, as the Vicha itself was entirely laid to waste. This eventually led, through many twists and turns, so it took some time to get to this, but to some occupation of a nearby, very large open green space, Parque Indoamericano. The setting up of tents here included some, not all, of those who had been given the very brief emergency housing there under the towers. This led to quite a lot of ire among local nearby residents, those who were not the poorest, but perhaps lower middle class to the poor, saying that these people didn't deserve to be here, that they had this lifestyle with their push carts, their horse-drawn vehicles. They didn't belong in the city, and that living in these kinds of conditions and looking as they did, they probably were not even Argentinian, that they must be Bolivian with their dark skin, living in teepees and huts, that they ought to go back to Bolivia, even eventually getting President Evo Morales of Bolivia to come and invite his compatriots back to Bolivia, although a survey was done in the following week, or sorry, in the following weeks that showed that at least 2/3 of these people were in fact Argentine citizens, but that they looked more indigenous and so were rejected as Bolivian or as some other kind of South American foreigner. This led to eventually a pitched conflict between those seeking to stay, asking for housing solutions in this photograph, and the neighbors saying, this is not correct. We're not xenophobic. If anybody here knows Argentina, the phrasing of this is saying the neighbors of the South, those in the somewhat more formal housing, we're not xenophobic, but we're also not idiots, claiming that this was a play to get some kind of free gift of housing, a play to use some kind of generosity of the Argentinian or the Buenos Aires state in order to get something free for nothing. This eventually led to a conflict where 2 people died, as police were not going to intervene, and different vigilante groups, some representing some political interests, it's been shown, came in and eventually broke this up in a violent struggle in late 2010. So eventually this was cleared away. Turning to another case, in Rio de Janeiro in Brazil. Here in the expansive favela of Complexo Alemão, you have a telepheric system which has been installed 2 years ago to link the hilltops of various points in this massive favela or informal settlement. Now, in a way, this provides a service to those who live in these areas. It connects them much more easily than they ever would have been before to the regularized transport infrastructure of the city, or at least that's the idea. However, very, very few residents actually use this system. At the top of each hill where you can alight from this telepheric system, you might see there, you can't quite see it, but in the top of the hill, you see a building just next to the portal there. This is part of the UPP, or the Police Pacifying Units. This is at every single telepheric station, and you can see the police cars there just below. At the terminus for this, the final stop, I took this photograph. You might see 3 heavily armed, bulletproof vest-wearing police officers in the sweltering heat of early January this year. They're standing guard, as they do at all of these different pacifying police stations, as part of a permanent occupation, in the language of the program itself, in an effort to pacify this space and to bring it back into the fabric of the city. Now, favelas are unique in a number of ways. For one thing, in favelas, people do not pay taxes. They're not required to pay taxes under current regulations, partly because they don't have legal title to this space. There are efforts at legalization and formalization, but a key part of this is the pacification process, as it is officially called in Portuguese, and has become part of Carioca or Rio lingo, to use this term of, is this space pacified or not? There's been an extension, a new line of this telepheric system that was opening up just when I was in Rio in early January, this time into a much more centrally located, much older favela here in Providencia. So going up from the main train station of Rio into the hills here, I went on one of the first rides when it opened up. I took this photograph as I was coming back over the hill, and I heard someone screaming at me. Now, it was this man here who was screaming at me in Portuguese not to take photos, as I was leaning out the gondola with my iPhone, being an awkward researcher and inciting the ire of a local resident. So here in this photo, he didn't say much, but he was saying, don't take photos, this is my space. This is where I live. So in his way, asserting a kind of claim on this is this is not a place for you just to come and take pictures and ride around in this infrastructure that in all likelihood, I don't know because I never spoke to him directly, but in all likelihood, he will never use himself. And indeed, there was only one local resident that I encountered in either of these places when I used the telepheric system. Very lastly, to close with Istanbul, conscious of time and the fact that there are many Istanbul experts here in the audience. So forgive me for my very cursory look at things that, at least in one of these incidents, people in the audience I'm sure know very well. And that is, this site here is Tarlabaşı in central Istanbul, but it's very near to famous Gezi Park, part of Taksim Square. Gezi became famous for the occupation by many Turkish residents across classes, across political views in 2013 to rebel against an effort to bulldoze the park as it was and to put in place a shopping mall designed on the design of an old Ottoman fort here. So it would have been remade, including some of the original elements, but mostly a vast remaking. This incited a small set of protests at first that grew in number and became quite performative in terms of pushing back against this, but also looking for support from abroad, asking here in English for global media, if this were to happen in one of the famous parks of other cities of the world, wouldn't you also be protesting? This led to quite a significant crackdown, as it also became quite famous. Rather brutal repression by the police, resulting in many injuries and several deaths. This, nonetheless, there were holdouts for some time to try to push back against this, and some quite poetic scenes, such as this one, some of these of rebellion, and these in a final push where there was a clamping down that eradicated this protest, even though it became quite massive, as you can see here. The result of this was not to build the shopping mall, but many of the sort of infrastructural changes did happen. So that when I returned to Istanbul, I was not there for the protests myself, but when I returned to Istanbul later in 2013 and found Taksim and Gezi to be looking like this, with an undergrounding of the roads that used to go around the park itself, an undergrounding of the bus station that used to serve the people at the surface level, and the concretization, literally the cementing of this space. I had never seen Taksim so dead in my life. And I mean, I'm not from there, but in the large amounts of time I've spent in Istanbul, I'd never seen it so deadened. So that this space that used to be quite significant and will always be a hub in some ways, had been totally devoided of its resources for people to come and gather and to use in much more everyday ways. Now, just around the corner from this, as I showed in the first Istanbul slide, is Tarlabaşı. In many ways, Tarlabaşı represents a classic rent gap. So there are certain ways that this idea of spatial capital can go right alongside a rent gap idea. This was an area that had become, through the late 20th century, deteriorated, inhabited by marginalized populations, ethnic minorities, a center for drug trade and prostitution, often derided for having some kind of provincial or rural lifestyle in the city, and was, through various legal measures, this was an area that was declared in need of being cleared out. So here, just after clearing, and here are some of the signs for Tarlabaşı becoming new again, or renewing itself, as it says here in Turkish. The idea for this renewal has largely been a specific kind of neo-Ottoman vision, much as was the idea also for what Gezi Park would have been remade as in the form of the shopping mall. And to just, again, so the Beyoğlu district renewal project for Tarlabaşı with certain Ottoman motifs in citation. So some concluding thoughts here. Across these very different cases and others that I think we could imagine elsewhere, I want to think about spatial capital in terms of who's wielding it. Is it the economically privileged? Is it the state? Can it also be other social groups? And are there groups in direct conflict with each other over the control of spatial capital and the valuing of it? I see many of these as not only, and in some cases even not at all, about money, but often not only about money, but indeed about righteousness. So in this case, we can have inter as well as intra-class markings of distinction, often marked on territory so that this place belongs to us. That place belongs perhaps to you, but you just don't belong here. This marks off value in the city as well as belonging. And I think that it's important to think about this in order to expand our sense of who is involved in gentrification. Is gentrification sometimes not the only process that's happening, but other kinds of battles over the control of space, perhaps operating with other currencies and not just money itself? Thank you.
Hello, everyone. So my name is Ebru Soytemel. I first would like to thank organizers for organizing this event and having me here. So today I will be talking about the gentrification literature in Turkey. I'm sorry, I don't have any photographs, no videos. It's in that sense a bit boring, but I'm glad Ryan showed some photos from Istanbul, and there are more presentations about Istanbul. So mine is a bit of a critical analysis or an attempt to analyze the gentrification literature in Turkey. The motivation for this paper came from 3 different areas. So first, I was writing my PhD and trying to engage with the mainstream gentrification literature and trying to make connections with this literature and analyze the case in Istanbul. And also, second and third motivation to look at the gentrification research in Turkey comes from the papers of Ferguson and Healy when they talked about the uses of neoliberalism as a tool of critique. So when I was reading these papers, I was thinking about the travels of gentrification theories, mainstream theories to Turkey, and how gentrification and urban research is used as a tool of analysis and critique in gentrification studies in Turkey. So this is the first time I'm presenting this. This is a very new paper. It's still in draft, and I very welcome your critiques, suggestions, comments. So I try to organize my thoughts in 4 different questions. So first, I was going to talk about what is the impact of mainstream gentrification and urban research on gentrification studies in Turkey. And secondly, I will talk about what are the conceptual problems and methodological difficulties which leads to class blindness, and how do researchers address, so I added this third question recently, because when I was going through all the papers, I found myself all of a sudden, oh, who are gentrifiers? How do they portray them? Why gentrification takes place? So the third question is about how the researchers identify the causes of gentrification. How do they portray, identify dislocation processes and different groups in gentrified neighborhoods? So the fourth one is my conclusion, a draft conclusion. So how can we deal with the difficulties that I'm going to address and so reveal different experiences of gentrification processes to develop more critical perspectives. So before I continue, I just would like to make something clear. My aim here is not to criticize what has been done, but I aim to address certain problems and point at certain things that that might help us to think about gentrification research in the future. So, started as a I was obviously following the literature, but for this workshop, inspired me, and within the last 2-3 months, I've been looking at all the papers, trying to collect them. So I identified 98 research papers that are dealing with gentrification research. Not all of them are directly gentrification research papers or theses, but I included the ones about urban transformation, if they use gentrification as an explanation or in their theoretical discussions. So these resources are reached through various channels. So I emailed authors, look at the Thesis Center of Turkey, online university archives, and it's not 100, it's 98. So 92 of them, in fact, of these papers are dealing with gentrification in Istanbul. So Istanbul is the main research area, and the other 6 are looking at cities like Ankara, Izmir, Mersin, but there are very few. So 37 of them are written in Turkish and 61 of them are in English. So quite a lot of them are graduate theses, like master theses, 2 PhD theses I could identify, and 17 of them are Turkish and 16 of them are English. So they're mainly, gentrification research is very popular, mainly in city and regional planning departments among the students and architecture, urban design students. Only 7 of these graduate theses are submitted to various departments. Obviously, history, you can understand. There were interesting public relations theses, looking at looking at how gentrification brought different marketing strategies, and there were a few, 1 or 2 sociology and anthropology theses. So when I look at the literature, and in the next slides, I will not only be talking about the first decade of the gentrification research in Turkey, but these 98 research papers, quite a few of them, in fact 52 of them are written after 2010. So this is my only picture. So gentrification studies have proliferated as a new research area in Turkey over the last 2 decades. So the first workshop was organized by the French Institute of Anatolian Studies in 2003. One of the organizers is here, Tolga, and he's also one of edited this book. So the workshop papers were published as a book. The book presents the earlier conceptual differences of researchers, where one can find different assumptions and perspectives and results about the profiles of the gentrifiers. These earlier discussions on gentrification processes initially focused on the etymological problems of translating gentrification into Turkish language. Due to the lack of a gentry class in Turkey and the corresponding lack of a term for such a concept, different suggestions were considered by different scholars. So as you can see, some suggested to translate it as nezihleştirmek, which means making neighborhoods more decent, more clean. But at the end, the term soylulaştırmak became well accepted, which means ennoblization, and is considered more critical. And lots of people using this one nowadays. Or some people just try, they continue using gentrification or gentrification in the research. So when you look at public officials or local municipalities talking about it, they generally refer it as a decent and cleaning, making neighborhoods more decent and clean. So scholars welcome the gentrification process due to its compatibility with strategic planning decisions. For some groups, gentrification was considered as a process with its potential to solve problems more efficiently and quickly. So this is related with planners talking about the bureaucratic master plans and bureaucratic ways of dealing with planning. So the discussion was related with, gentrification can be similar to strategic planning, which can be a quick fix. On the other hand, gentrification as a term has never been used in policy documents. Urban transformation, urban renewal, urban conservation, and urban regeneration has been the main terms of urban policy terminology at that time. During this first decade of gentrification research in Turkey, gentrification was not yet a dirty word and is often related to globalization of Istanbul. So researchers explored examples from Western literature and Western cities and tried to identify comparable areas or neighborhoods in Istanbul. Bosphorus neighborhoods like Arnavutköy, Kuzguncuk, and Ortaköy, and inner city neighborhoods like Galata, Cihangir, Fener, and Balat became the focus of gentrification research in Istanbul. While some sociologists focus on the influence of globalization on the development of new identities, new shopping malls, tourist areas, and distribution of wealth in Istanbul, urban planners and architects focus on urban regeneration, urban renewal, competitive cities, world cities. So the discussions that are engaged with gentrification literature were quite different in terms of academic disciplines. So who are the not only the etymological problem, but the discussion was also related with do we have gentrifiers? Who are they? Are they similar to gentrifiers mentioned in the mainstream literature? So in these earlier discussions, what we see is the gentrifiers often referred as occupational groups, like occupational people were mentioning about their positions, in their occupational positions. And in most of the examples, gentrification is considered as a process where actors, gentrifiers, are assessed as innocent individuals who are acting individually, who loves living in historical houses, or in some cases, gentrifiers are often mentioned as newcomers to the neighborhood. So this is one example. This is so I highlighted the. I'm not saying I'm critical about the book, but the book, because it was a first book and it has really interesting discussions, but it also has some quick generalizations. So here, Ergun looks at the mainstream literature and says, okay, they look at this, they have this, do we have the same thing? So she says, oh, we don't have developers, insurance, or construction companies who are willing to generate urban rent from these areas, and young, childless professionals who are looking for adventures and who can afford to spend money to move to these areas. These do not exist in Istanbul, so maybe we don't have any gentrifiers. And then she looks at more evidence. She looks at the census results. And she says, okay, so let's look at 25 to 39 age groups. Okay, 31% of Istanbul. And she looks at the high levels of education. So this is kind of, I think this quote really gives an example of assessment of mainstream literature. And then she says, among those, the number of people who will restore old buildings will be very limited. Although it's changing, our cultural structure pushes us to early marriage and having children, restrictions and rules imposed by conservation boards. Apart from these, younger generations' lack of income to invest and their addiction to cars and comfort will make it to restore these buildings individually. So she doesn't think that gentrification will happen soon, or we have gentrifiers like mentioned in the mainstream literature. So I come to my first question. So what is the impact of mainstream gentrification literature on gentrification studies in Turkey? But first I would like to say, okay, thank you. I would like to say two general observations. First of all, most of the papers I looked at has project-based focus. So project-based, you can see researchers engage with the planning or the field work, or the is mainly organized around one neighborhood project. And I think this has their focus and scope often remains within the scope of this project, and this has impact on their perceptions and assumptions on which groups to engage with during the research, or often they overlook other processes, simultaneous or different processes. And in most cases, participation or disengagement or dislocation is considered within the project terms, and they mainly engage with the groups who are mainly engaging with or who are involved in the project. The second observation is almost all of the papers mention a historical background of the neighborhoods they are analyzing. But I find these historical narratives quite descriptive, and there's a linear understanding of how these neighborhoods changed, and they're always based on assumptions. There's migration happened, this happened, and they are not critical. So there were non-Muslim minorities living in inner city neighborhoods. They left, so their houses might be new migrants moved into that houses. So there's a kind of a non-critical engagement with the historical background of the neighborhoods. I find it important because I was, later I will mention it, because I think this critical engagement with the historical background can help us to understand how rent gap developed in these areas. So when I mention the mainstream literature, so Smith, Lay, Hamnet, Zukin, Harvey, and Sassen are often cited authors. Everyone cites them, but as I mentioned earlier, the discussions about globalization is quite important in theoretical discussions. World city literature, urban renewal, regeneration literature are often cited. And gentrification is often considered as an inevitable stage or a result of globalization or neoliberalization. And there's also discussion about the different phases of gentrification processes. So researchers try to identify different waves, but this leads to really speculations. And it happened to one of the scholars that when she talks to a newspaper about her research, the next day, the title of the newspaper was Tips from a Sociologist for the Next Gentrifiable Neighborhood. So it's there's a problem with that. And recently, state-led gentrification framework become important, but this also recreates the project-based focus. So the second slide, thank you, I hope I will finish, is about the conceptual problems. So we don't have data, so in that sense, and lack of data means data is sometimes available but not reliable, or sometimes not open. So census is limited, address-based results are not open, there are no longitudinal data, household surveys are cross-sectional, so you name it. And difficulties referring to different groups in gentrification research as income groups. So this is the often employed strategy by researchers. They refer people either by their occupations or income groups, but then this creates further problems. And the difficulties about city district level analysis. So Istanbul has 36 districts. Some of them has 2 million or 1 million inhabitants. So researchers prefer to deal with district level analysis, but this sometimes causes bias in terms of differences in neighborhoods. Difficulties referring to the rent gap theory, because when I look at the literature, when people talk about rent gap theory, or when they want to refer their analysis to rent gap theory, they were mainly referring to more general processes of globalization or capitalism, neoliberalism. So, but there are not enough tools to discuss these or collect data. You can see the difficulties of collecting data which represents which links to rent gap theory. There are assuming, yeah, so I go to the third slide. I will have one more slide. So when I look at these papers, who are gentrifiers, how people portray them, are they middle-class groups, or apart from their occupations, what do they say? So researchers mention most of the papers, gentrifiers are absent. So you read something without a subject, and it's mainly about the processes and policies. And when they are portrayed as artists. They are portrayed as like fictional characters. And they are mainly referred as innocent individuals, artists, writers, intellectuals, and gentrification is also considered as a process of liberalization. And they mention the diversity discourse of gentrifiers, but researchers never challenge them. They portray this discourse as a something positive. And displacement, eviction is considered as a process which is not linked to or related to gentrifiers or what's happening in the everyday life of neighborhood, but as a result of bigger unstoppable processes. And I think there's another thing that I can say. There's a modernist perspective of planning, urban renewal, and physical planning, which believes in if we plan, if we do urban renewal really good, we can solve the problems of deprived areas, although nobody mentions what does deprived mean in different cases. And also the modernist perspective of cultural heritage. So we have to protect these neighborhoods. There's a great potential here, so you can read that behind. So my concluding question, so how can we deal with these difficulties and reveal different experiences of gentrification processes to develop more critical examples? I think, first of all, what I've seen was gentrification research in Turkey is blind to other literature. So we have to engage with different literatures. And also we have to think about which relationships on the everyday level are researched. When researchers go to neighborhoods, what kind of data or who they look for. So how do we plan fieldwork and data collection? And we can't continue with our perceptions about different groups, like different income groups or migrant groups. We might use new methods, using mixed methods, or using different resources. That's how I survived with my PhD. I used multiple correspondence analysis to look at the relational everyday practices between different groups, and maybe challenging perceptions. Yes, diversity is good, but what kind of diversity are these people are talking about? And this is my last slide. And this literature really helped me. Tom's paper, which he gave a talk yesterday, so he mentions about digging into archives. I don't know how this is, if it is possible in the case of Turkey. Yes, we need more empirical studies, not only policy framework. And Bahar's paper about considering this location with inserting temporality to this location analysis. And again, Bahar and Tolga's paper about looking at power relations, policy shifts in urban policy. And finally, Peter Marquez's paper of 2013, which he says, so what are the benefits or costs to those residents in place at the beginning of the processes and remaining in place? Thought are perhaps the most controversial aspects of the process. And for planning students, a challenge maybe who are doing research in gentrification, what does remain if we do not talk about physical renewal? And thank you.
Thank you to all three of our speakers. I will, with your permission, use the first part of the coffee break to begin the discussion about the papers, and the second part of the coffee break to take coffee and continue the discussion. In view of time, I want to go straight to questions from the floor rather than taking chair's privilege to ask some of my own. So could I ask people for questions or comments? Down the front here first. And we have a mic, if you would. And perhaps again, if we can take a group of questions. So I have one here, and another one here. Okay, thank you.
Hi, good morning. Sarah Lilly, urban planner. If we're looking at one of the definitions of gentrification in terms of social differences and newcomers using an area differently to those who have previously been there, how can we explain what has been going on in Spitalfields in London, for instance, for years and years, knowing that the area has always been an area of immigration and newcomers and different layers of neighborhood users, such as Jewish immigrants, before them Huguenot, and then, you know, the Bangladeshi. So when can we say that an area is starting to get gentrified? And I mean, weren't they at the time gentrifiers in relation to those that were before them? And speaking of San Francisco, I'm wondering what your thoughts are about the Tenderloin area. Can we say that an area like the Tenderloin has resisted gentrification compared to like Mission, Castro, and the Haight, for instance? That were, I mean, I'm not very familiar with the history of San Francisco, but I would assume that they could be compared at the time in the 60s and 70s.
Thank you. And the gentleman in the second row.
Thank you. My question to Ebru. I'm so glad you mentioned multiple correspondence analysis. I guess nobody in Lebanon use it, or rare, and this is extremely powerful methodology. Can you tell us what kind of factors you deploy and the survey you will conduct before in order to do your analysis, and which software you will use?
And Robert Saliba.
I find Ebru's intervention fascinating because it has high relevance to the Beirut case, okay, to any research in terms of gentrification in Beirut. However, I would like to emphasize two aspects. The first one is the translation of the term. I was really interested to see how the malleability of translating this term and how it could be redefined according to if it comes from disciplinary or political perspectives. And one of the terms that came to mind, for instance, the ennobling was interesting. One of how politicians will refer to it. I was thinking about, since neo-Osmanization was used a lot, linking this phenomena to colonization. I was thinking about embourgeoisement. Can we translate gentrification to embourgeoisement? Are we talking, when we are talking about gentrification, is it the upper middle class we are referring to, or the middle class we are referring to? Gentry has a aristocratic sound to it, so it's not clear how we can translate this term. It will be interesting to discuss this particular definition. The second and last point is that in relation to the notions, I know that School of Chicago is not very well seen now, but there is the issue of about the process of invasion and succession, okay, of inner districts in cities. And I see that in Beirut, for instance, if we tie the gentrification to colonization, we see that in upper districts, upper class districts in Beirut, for instance, we did not have this phenomena of invasion and succession by different class groups. We have at this particular point, for instance, mansions, okay, aristocratic mansions that are being transformed directly into high rises by the families themselves, without this the same. We saw, for instance, always this notion of neo-colonialism in relation to gentrification. So these are just thoughts.
Thank you for those three questions. We'll take responses to those first. They neatly fit into our concerns with theory and methodology. Andrew, could I ask you to start by speaking about a case like Spitalfields in terms of a historical comparative approach?
Yes, so I mean, it's very interesting that you use the word newcomers, because actually, if you talk to sociologists in the UK about Ruth Glass, they won't necessarily know about gentrification. They'll know about her 1960 book, Newcomers, which was about West Indian migration to London. Actually, actually very well known amongst certain urban sociology community. So, yeah, I mean, she was very interested in how migrant groups were absorbed, some often not very well, into London. And yeah, Spitalfields is an interesting example. All these sorts of interesting layers of history, and it's a fascinating place because, yeah, it's to get Huguenots, Jewish, Irish actually often get left out, and recently Bengali. I mean, I think what's obviously key here is, and perhaps this comes back to the discussion last night about actually gentrification is for progressively more affluent users, and actually a lot of the time Spitalfields was, for people who were, at the bottom of the class structure, and this was, a cheap place for them to live. They weren't, really using the area potentially as a form of spatial capital, to use Ryan's phrase. So, but at the same time, I think it'd be interesting to go back and to do some of that kind of historical analysis. I think that's something we don't do at all. I think perhaps apart from Neil Smith, there's very little gentrification research that has this kind of historical nuance, actually. So it would be interesting to look at perhaps some of the Huguenot weavers who were perhaps, did quite well. And I mean, it's very interesting that actually the gentrification that's gone on in Spitalfields it's all about the kind of architectural heritage. If you go down one of those streets in Spitalfields, it is like a sort of period drama. I mean, it's often used for those very purposes. So it'd be very interesting to kind of compare actually how Huguenots thought about their neighbourhood when they moved there, and the sort of kind of architectural sort of design that they use, and compare that to how it's now being sort of co-opted in interesting ways by recent gentrifiers.
And Ryan, is Tenderloin a gentrification-resistant district?
All right. Right. So thanks for the question on San Francisco. Certainly, you can say that the Tenderloin, for those of you who don't know, this is right. This is a district just adjacent to the most touristed part of San Francisco. Many hotels, many quite a significant business district and retail district. In the center, the Tenderloin is just next door. The name, as I understand it, Tenderloin, comes from this being an area that was more dangerous and therefore more highly rewarded for police, and so that if they worked in this area, then they would have enough extra pay to afford a tenderloin steak. I don't know if this is just urban folklore, but it is in common circulation. So for quite a long time, it has been an area that's been considered marginal despite its physical centrality in the city. As to whether we could call it gentrification resistant, I wouldn't say exactly. I mean, just being at a conference on the border of the Tenderloin in August, not having been in San Francisco for a couple years before that, I could really see that this place is not gentrified at the most superficial level. There are a lot of homeless people, very obvious homeless people on the street, but also there has been a remaking of homelessness in San Francisco, much of which has had the Tenderloin as its epicenter. So a remaking of single occupancy residence units, which would have perhaps been places that homeless or nearly homeless people would circulate in and out of, many of those being remade. So there is a continuing collection, a location of homelessness and housing precarity there, as much of what would have been available disappears. So it's not totally resistant to gentrification, but it has not been fully gentrified. I don't think it's exactly comparable to the Mission in that while it has had residents, as a very different kind of resident than in the Mission District. So while also marginalized, not quite as sort of precarious and stigmatized exactly, a different kind of stigma in the Mission versus the Tenderloin. I have some comments on some of the other points, but I can leave those for. But the question also about Spitalfields, I use Spitalfields example. I use the Mission example in my teaching and trying to provoke my students to think about when do we stop the clock? So even if the arrival of Huguenots and Eastern European Jews in Spitalfields, even if they weren't gentrifiers in the sense that they weren't more privileged, that in some way the neighborhood, the area was different before. So when do we stop the clock in thinking about what we should mourn or what we should mobilize to protect? Because spaces in central areas of cities have changed for quite a long time. Do we mourn it and mobilize to protect it depending on the conditions of its transformation? So that it's fine if people choose to move out. It's not okay if there is a sense that there is a crowding out instead. So that's an issue I often come back to. But also, do we mourn places if it's not seen to be something that is righteous, not seen to be something that is dignified? Do we mourn the demise of gay districts in some neighborhoods? Do we mourn the demise of certain subcultural areas? Or do we let those go because they're not righteous, even if they are disappearing? Some other thoughts on the translation of gentrification, which can be translated in the cases that I talked about in Brazil and in Spanish-speaking Latin America in different ways, sometimes directly mirroring embourgeoisement, but I think that it depends on what exactly we want to refer to and if we want to be that specific, or is it more analytically useful in some cases to have a broader definition rather than to look just at the middle class or the upper middle class. In some cases that's important, but sometimes it can lead us to be too specific, I think.
And Ebru, could you speak to the methodological question about multiple correspondence analysis? For those of you who I'm sure as most people in the room who are not familiar with this method, to put it very simply, this is a way of looking at network relationships in various fields. So in this case, who would you be looking at and what kinds of associations would you be interested in to make sense of urban change?
Okay, so I use multiple correspondence analysis for a couple of reasons. First of all, I don't want to refer to different groups in my research areas, income groups or occupational groups. I knew that it's more layered, there were more actors, more different actors, different gentrifiers, there are informal processes. So that's why what I did was during the field work, I collected my own data. So my supervisor was making a joke like, you can retire with your with this data. So I collected my neighborhood level survey and mainly trying to understand the different distribution of means in different households and families, who has enough means, who doesn't have. Do gentrifiers, all of them are like rich people or not? So I was trying to understand these differences. I use multiple correspondence analysis for one important reason. First of all, I want to put all different groups in the analysis and relational to each other. So multiple correspondence analysis enabled me to look at the position takings of different groups in the same field. So I can say I attempted to show the social space of gentrification through multiple correspondence analysis. And I used my survey and I integrated different factors related to the historical background of the city, like migration. I can give you the paper or we can talk it later. I use Spot as a software and multiple correspondence analysis. Those who doesn't have familiarity with the quantitative analysis, it's a descriptive analysis, and the learning curve is really good. So I really, if you want to talk about it, we can talk during the coffee break. And the second question about the different translations, I didn't mention, in the first 10 years of gentrification research in Turkey, there were different uses. Mainly, I can say two groups. Some were using it mutenalaşma and nezihleşme, which means selecting carefully, or those who are using those translations are mainly referring to David Ley, Sharon Zukin, artists, the potential in the in these neighborhoods, potential in these houses. Those who are referring to it as an ennobilization is like soylulaş with the ending ma, which means don't become like nobles. So it has inside like a it became more critical, and in later years, recently, if you look at it, there are these two versions, and the others slowly grouped in these two headings. And in terms of bourgeoislaşma, I am not sure, because bourgeois, I don't know, from my understanding, refers to something more national. So more one layer, something, it's in terms of when I think about Turkey and the gentrification research and the types of gentrifiers we see in different neighborhoods, there are more layers. So I'm not sure, international layers, informality, so I'm not sure bourgeoislaşma will be useful.
Andrew, following your ideas, why not to relearn also what you and we understand as colonialism, its application for gentrification studies, especially as the concept does not apply everywhere in the world. And on the other hand, it might reflect to European-centric perspective, center-periphery relation in certain areas of the world. So that's my question.
And there's another question just behind you. Oh, sorry, I was behind.
Thank you very much. My name is Samar Kanafani. I'm a social anthropologist, and my question goes to Ryan's research. I was wondering if you could tell us more. We didn't hear that much about what you meant by fracture, by the city fracture. If you could say a bit more about that. And my second question has to do with your concluding remarks about whether righteousness had come to, and so how I understand that to be the struggle over authenticity and belonging. whether that had come to replace money as a source of struggle, and whether in fact righteousness doesn't emerge as the core of the struggle precisely in times of precarity, or for those who are most precarious. So it's that way that I would imagine righteousness would become linked with struggle over resources. What you thought about that? Thank you.
And just in
I think my point and question is just to all of them, basically all of the presenters, and it's basically also refers to Ernesto's question, like if we start with like what Andrew did, looking at the historical return and and what Ebru was talking about, like the translation of this concept into the local context. My question was more about like, or thinking through these processes, was just like, if we start with the context that we are studying, and then ask the questions from there, and reverse the questions to where the literature comes from. Like for instance, I studied Istanbul first, and then jumped to Amsterdam, and then asked the questions of Istanbul to Amsterdam to understand Amsterdam, rather than vice versa, which we're mostly trying to do. And that made things more fruitful for me, for instance, to understand informality in the context of Western countries, which we don't really see or which we don't really focus on. And I was wondering your reflections on this based on your theoretical or fieldwork experience.
Yes, so thanks, Ernesto. Yes, I do take your point, and I guess that's a product of my own sort of positionality, and also, I guess, the context of the way that Ruth Glass was working between these different parts of the world. But at the same time, towards the end there, I was trying to suggest that even if you don't necessarily have the kind of the sort of explicit kind of colonial histories, actually, and this perhaps connects to Baha's point about, you know, looking at it from the particular context, there's probably other sorts of historical points of reference to use. They may not be framed in a certain kind of sort of colonial engagement, or they may not necessarily have the kind of explicit kind of gentry class, which I think is often the problem perhaps in a city like Istanbul. But I think, yes, working from that particular city and maybe, dare I say, even kind of unlearning some of the context, you know, the approaches we have. You know, it may require different sorts of methodologies, different sorts of vocabularies, while retaining some of the kind of bigger sorts of understandings of what we mean about gentrification being a process of class-based urban change involving displacement. I think that really is the way to go. Just one last point about, I mean, I guess probably what I didn't talk about is actually we can use that idea around colonization to think about not only a city like Mumbai, but also a city like London, which is, you know, also a post-colonial city, and you know, even someone like Spitalfields actually would work very well, I think, through that sort of mode of analysis.
Thank you for the questions. So in terms of the specific ones about some of the terms and ideas in my presentation, I didn't say much about any one of these terms because I was trying to rush through probably too many cases, so my mistake there. But when I talk about a fracture, I mean this in terms of a break in this sort of boundary or a break in the city. And I thought it was useful to think about spatial capital in this sense, in terms of trying to break urban space to mark new kinds of boundaries and an assertion of some kind of territoriality. So a fracture in that sense, it's sort of an active breaking up of marking of boundaries in space, in urban space. And when I talked about righteousness, I don't think that righteousness has replaced money. I think that it's something else to look at, and I think it can be connected to money, but it can be connected to religion. Righteousness is almost always done in the name of something. So it can be nakedly about privilege, but it can also be about something done in the name of the law, something done in the name of the family, something done in the name of X, Y, or Z religion. So any number of things here might be considered righteous. Righteousness matters, whatever type we're talking about. Righteousness matters because it is supposed to legitimize its effects and it tries to command agreement, but it doesn't always work. So in the example of the soccer field, this paper, which they've spent $27 to make a reservation for, this is supposed to be a certain form of righteousness, but it's rejected by the lifelong users of this park. So it did have legal weight. It was a system imposed by the city of San Francisco, and it was then withdrawn after this went viral online. But it was about a certain kind of codified, in this case, righteousness. But I think that it can be other sorts of things. And so certainly you're right that in some situations of precarity, righteousness may be a turn it may be a turn away from money if this is something that's less available among elites or certain status holders than it used to be. So it can involve that, but it can take on a number of different valences, I think, depending on the situation. And indeed, righteousness can come from the wealthy or the poor or different places. In terms of the locatedness and historicity of how I looked at these cases, it was interesting when Andrew was doing his presentation and making me think more about the deep historicity of Ruth Glass's ideas. I started to think about, okay, so, and then when you use Neil Smith's example of the frontier and the sort of US folklore about expansions to the West, I started to write down, okay, what is this in each of my cases? And I could really quickly see certainly I don't know if we want to talk about a deep psychic trace or something in the US case of one of the memes that went up from that video afterwards is the guy at the end of the video saying this is disastrously awkward, says, "Happy Columbus Day from Dropbox." So the idea that this is Columbus coming and staking claim on this space and rejecting in many of the examples here, young men of color from this space. So perhaps a kind of link to, if not Columbus, then perhaps some kind of homesteading and westward expansion in the US in that case. In Buenos Aires, very much a clash between people who identify with European immigration against those they mark as indigenous and less cultivated, less European. Very clear marks of slavery in Rio, in Brazil, in terms of the favelas, in terms of their marking as racially other, as specifically African descent, but also class marked as well. And in Istanbul, the Ottoman trope is central. The idea that this is a re-Ottomanization as if that were offering its own righteousness, which has been rejected in many cases, but continues to be a key trope in this, which can also connect, I think, to the idea of a certain class and not just a moment in time.
What is Ottomanization? I couldn't understand your... What does it mean?
The use of Ottoman tropes,
okay.
the sort of use of Ottoman motifs and ideas.
For Bahar's question, so first of all, I want to clarify that I'm not saying mainstream literature is useless. We should not quote it or refer to it. It's very useful. It was, I was, when I was feeling very desperate when I was writing my PhD, that was the only literature that I hold on to, because otherwise there are other literatures that informality, migration, gender, that doesn't really explain what was happening in my area. So I survived by looking at other literatures and to try to find out possible linkages with the gentrification literature. So in terms of locatedness and historical analysis of certain issues, concepts, I think what I try to show is, first of all, researchers do not mention anything about the class analysis in Turkey. There's class analysis in Turkey, which exists in mainly in economic journals. Although they refer to occupations, they prefer to refer to mainstream literature, not to the research about occupational class analysis in Turkey. And also there's a kind of a disciplinary bias. So, you can engage with these terms. What does gentrification, or social justice means in the Turkish context? But if you're not critically engaged with, for example, the historical background, historical narratives about these neighborhoods, you can if you don't challenge certain things, then you can your analysis can be more descriptive or not really critical. So in that sense, a genealogical perspective is important, but also we should engage with what is in that local more critically and by challenging certain assumptions.
I know there are a number of questions still in the room, but I fear we must take some coffee before we begin our next session. Hopefully you will be able to corner the speakers, but also these questions and issues will return at other parts of the discussion. Robert also raised the issue of family capital and generational upgrading, which is something I think we may well return to in later sessions. May I ask you again to thank our 3 speakers this morning.